How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Beis, Daf 102 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, Daf Kuf Beis is a very difficult daf. Daf Kuf Beis is a very difficult daf. It's the kind of daf that we had like 100 of them in Masechta Menachos. No, Masechta Zvachim. Menachos we probably had like 50 of them. It's a real kudshimi. It's a real grind, slow moving. We're gonna work through this daf. It's a hard one. It's a real. You gotta. It's one step at a time. Anyways, I'll tell you what it's about. It's about kol ha-omed lizrok dami. Kol ha-omed lizrok dami. Oof. Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh boy. That's a tough sugya. That's a tough sugya, even just thinking about it. Because it's complex. It's going to take us 10 minutes just to when we get started. My guess is going to be 10 minutes of just catch up from yesterday, just so that we could start the daf. Okay, kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami. It's a tough daf. It's a tough concept. Okay, and then the next. So then we get up to a new Mishnah, and Daf Kuf Beis and Beis. We get up to a new Mishnah, and it's about declaration of intent for a type of mincha. Meaning, if a person says, "I'm going to bring a minchas machvas," and he brings a minchas marcheshes, what happens? So we're going to discuss that, and then that'll get us to the next Mishnah, which we'll work on tomorrow. Gird yourselves. It's going to be a tough one. My guess it's going to be a long one too, because we got to get to the Mishnah and Daf Kuf Gimel. We have to, otherwise we're going to be in trouble. So but it's going to be amazing at the same time. Obviously, yeah, I didn't say that because it's obviously it's going to be amazing. We're going to have a great time, a great hard time. But sometimes when the hard things are the best ones, right? They're all the best ones. Have you ever? What daf of Gemara wasn't the best daf of Gemara? There's thousands of best dafs of Gemara. Right? You heard Reb Soloveitchik the other day. Hogus Lev. Friends, let's learn Daf Kuf Beis of Masechta Menachos. Okay, so as I mentioned in the introduction, just so that we can start learning today's daf, we need to do a review from yesterday. Without the review from yesterday, we will be lost. So, yesterday we learned a few things. So, yesterday we began the 12th parak of Masechta Menachos. And we learned there about being poda a korban mincha. So, we said that so long as the mincha has not yet been put in a klishar, so it's kadosh kedushas dam. And we said certainly if it becomes tameh, it's kadosh kedushas damim, and it becomes tameh, you can be poded, right? It's monetary kedusha as opposed to kedusha saguf, which is a kedusha of the body of the item itself, right? The thing itself is kadosh. No, it's not the thing itself. It has monetary value and it can be redeemed. Certainly, if it becomes tameh. The question was, what if it is tahor? Can you redeem it if it's tahor? You designate flour to be used for the korban mincha, and now you want to just be poda it and make it chulin. So we saw some machlokes between Shmuel and Rav Huna bar Manoach. Shmuel says yes, you can be poda. You can simply be poda the korban mincha. You can be poda the flour so long as it hasn't yet been put in the klisharis, even if it's tahor. Whereas Rav Huna bar Manoach and other Amoraim had said that no, only if it's tameh can you be poded. If it's tahor, you cannot be poded. Okay. Now, Rabbi Oshaya had said, well, let's even talk about Rabbi Oshaya for a second. Rabbi Oshaya had two ways of explaining. Right? First, I think he sided with Shmuel. Let's take a look. Rabbi Oshaya Tamein Niftin Tahorin and Niftin. Okay. Rabbi Oshaya Afilu Tar Niftin. Okay. So first, he sided with Rav Huna bar Manoach. First, Rabbi Oshaya had said that only if the flour is tameh can it be redeemed. If it's tahor, it cannot be redeemed. And then there was a different version of Rabbi Shaya where he agrees with Shmuel, who says that even if it's tahor, it can be redeemed. Great. Rabbi Shaya then made another statement. Rabbi Shaya said that according to Reb Shimon, when it comes to pigul by menachos, so the shirayim, I'm assuming it's the shirayim will not become tummy with tumas ha'ochlin. The shirayim will not become, remember it's machlokes about understanding if it's to become tummy or to convey tuma. The Rambam understands it as to become tummy, and that's how I've been learning. So Reb Shimon says, so Rabbi Shaya says that according to Reb Shimon, when it comes to pigul of a korban mincha, so the shira, so you burn, let's say you burn the kometz with the intention of eating the shirayim chutz zmanu. So the shirayim are now puzzle. You have to burn it. You can't get any benefit from it. And says Rabbi Shai that according to Reb Shimon, since you can't get any benefit from this mincha, since it's pigul, there's no tumas ochlin. It won't contract tumas ochlin. Okay. Now, we had asked at the end of the daf yesterday that, however, it's a problem because there's a brisa in which Reb Shimon says that pigul by a korban mincha, there will be tumas ochlin. That there is tumas ochlin by pigul by a korban mincha, which is obviously a problem for Rabbi Shaya, who had said that according to Reb Shimon, there wouldn't be pigul. But it's a problem for Rabbi Shai, who says according to Reb Shimon there wouldn't be any tumas ochlin by pigul of a mincha. It would not be able to contract tumas ochlin, and yet we have a brisa that says that there would be pigul. So we answered, well, it depends at what point. It depends if there was a shasa kosher. It depends at what point you were makdish the grain to be a korban mincha. If it was already harvested, which means that once it was harvested, it was mutter. Right? It was ochel. It was right. You harvested. You could do whatever you want. You can eat it, whatever. So yeah, it could be mitame. It can contract tumas ochlin. If then at a later point you decided that you were going to make it into a korban mincha, well, it will already be mitame tumas ochlin, and therefore the brisa when it says that Reb Shimon says that pigul by a korban mincha, nonetheless it could be mitame tumas ochlin because it had a shasa kosher. It wasn't always going to be a korban mincha. When you harvested it, it wasn't yet designated as a mincha, and you could have eaten it, do whatever you want with it. So therefore, it's able to contract tumas ochlin. However, when Reb Oshaya was saying that according to Reb Shimon there would be no tumas ochlin, that is when you were makdish the grain when it was still growing, it was still connected to the ground, you were makdish it, which means that already by the time you harvested it, it was already kadosh to be used for the korban, and therefore there was never a shasa kosher, and therefore it will not contract tumas ochlin. Okay, fine. Therefore it will not contract tumas ochlin. Now, we're not done yet. This is still from yesterday, and this is crucial for us to be able to keep moving today. Now, we had then said, wait a second. Rabbi Shaya, there were two versions of Rabbi Shaya, right? One version that he agreed with Shmuel, that a mincha could be redeemed even when it's tahor. And the other version, he disagreed with Shmuel, and he says, no, if the mincha is tahor, it can't be redeemed. Again, if certainly, we're talking about before it's been put in a klishars, right? So according to one version, he agrees with Shmuel that it can be redeemed when it's tahor. According to the other version, he disagrees with Shmuel and says it cannot be redeemed when it's tahor. So now the Gemara had said, okay, I understand according to the opinion that, according to the version of Rabbi Shaya, that when the grain, so we're talking about grain, that you were makdish the grain when it was still connected to the ground. You then harvested the grain. Now the grain was not yet put in a klisharis. Now if you say that, look, the grain is tahor, you're not allowed to be podet so long as it's tahor, so I get it. There was never a shasa kosher. You were makdish it when it was still connected to the ground. You harvested it. You can't be podet because it's tahor. So I get it. There was never a shasa kosher, and therefore there's not going to be tumas ochlin. But according to the version of Rabbi Shaya, who agrees with Shmuel that you can be podet grain that is tahor, right? Even though you were makdish it to be a korban mincha, but now you harvest it, and you can be poda it, even though it's tahor, so long as it hasn't yet been put in a klisharis. So if you say that you can be poda it, so let him be poda it, and then it would have a shasa kosher. It would have a shasa kosher, and therefore it should be able to contract tumas ochlin. To which the Gemara answered, and with this the Gemara ended yesterday, and with this we start. This is where our Gemara begins today. The Gemara answers, well, at this point, he hasn't been podeh, and therefore it's still kadosh. So meaning, yes, he was makdish the grain when it was still connected to the ground. He harvested it. It's tahor. Potentially he can be podeh, but he wasn't podeh. Therefore it's still kadosh. It never has a shasa kosher. It never has a point where you can eat it. It's always going to be a korban, and therefore it's never going to contract tumas ochlin. It's never going to contract tumas ochlin. This is where our daf begins. Because our daf begins by saying, wait a second. Reb Shimon would say that just the fact that there is the potential to be poded, meaning we're saying that according to the version of Reb Ushaya that agrees with Shmuel, that you can be poded this grain, this flour, before it's been put in a klisharis, from the fact that Reb Ushaya, that this version of Reb Ushaya agrees with Shmuel that you would be able to be poded, well, Reb Shimon, who we're talking about, whether Reb Shimon would say that it can contract tumas ochlin, Reb Shimon would say from the fact that you're able to be poded, we should treat it as though you were poded to the extent that it should be able to be mitame tumas ochlin. It should be considered like, since you were able to be poded, like you were poded, therefore that is shasa kosher, and therefore it would be able to be mitame tumas ochlin. Okay, I had said that it would be about 10 minutes of introduction just to be able to start. It looks like it's been I think it's about 9.5 minutes of introduction just so that we can start today's daf. So yeah, and this is very thorough. Mamish had to go step by step through yesterday's Gemara, and today's also is going to be very thorough. I'm going to take a shluck of tea, and we're gonna get started here. Okay, here we go. Let me see. Did I? Yeah, okay, great. Amazing. Okay, let us get started over here. Where are we? We are about 10 lines or so before the Gemara gets wide, probably about 15 lines from the bottom of Daf Kuf Aleph ha-omed Beis. And here we go. V'cheven de ibai parakle. Do you see where I am? Again, about 10 lines before it gets wide. V'cheven de ibai parakle. So again, right, as we've discussed in the introduction, we had two introductions today, the general introduction and the more specific introduction. As we just discussed in the specific introduction, that since, right, according to the version of Rav Ushaya, that he agrees with Shmuel, that this grain, even though it's tahor, you would be able to be poded, since it's only kedushas damim. Well, since he would be able to be poded, we know that Reb Shimon's opinion is ha-omed livdos kipari dami. That Reb Shimon's shita is that something that stands to be poded, such as this grain that was harvested, that we're saying according to this version, he agrees with Shmuel that you can be poded this grain, even though it's tahor. Well, since you can, right, kol ha-omed liftos, anything that stands to be redeemed, kipari dami, we'll treat it as though it was redeemed, and therefore we should treat it as though this grain had a shasa kosher, and it should be mitame tumas ochlin. The sanya that we learn in Abraise, Reb Shimon says, Reb Shimon, parit mitama tumas ochlin, oil ve'oisa lo shasa kosher. That a pori adume, the meat of a paraduma, once it's been slaughtered, its meat is mitame tumas ochlin. How come? Why? Why should that be though? If the paraduma is also bano, you were makdish this red heifer to be a paraduma. while it was alive, you obviously couldn't eat the meat. And you slaughter the animal, you slaughter the parah aduma. It's asur ba'ana. I don't understand. Why would the meat of the parah aduma be mitame tumas ochlin? There was never a shasa kosher. Right? The Tzani Reb Shimon says Reb Shimon, parah adume mitame tumas ochlin. That parah aduma can contract tumas ochlin. Oil ve'oisala shasa kosher, since it was kosher at some point. When was it kosher? The Omer Rish Lakish answers that question of when was it kosher. Omer Haya Reb Shimon, that Reb Shimon would say, para nifdes al gabe ma'arachta. That a parah aduma, you can be poded the parah aduma even post shchita. That Reb Shimon says, okay, so meaning while the animal was alive, obviously it was also, you couldn't eat it while it was alive. Now you slaughter the animal. Reb Shimon says even post slaughter of the parah aduma, you could still be poded. Why? I feel like we've discussed that in other places. I think it has to do with the fact that the parah aduma is actually considered kedushas bedek habayis. But anyways, we're not getting into why. Reb Shimon holds that you could be, therefore, right? So Reb Shimon says that once you slaughter the parah aduma, and now there's the meat of the parah aduma, and the parah aduma, you can still be poded according to Reb Shimon. According to Reb Shimon, even post slaughter of the parah aduma, you can still be poded it and redeem it onto money. Transfer its kedusha onto money and use a different parah aduma. And since you can be poded the parah aduma after it's been slaughtered and there's its meat, since you can be poded, that is why, well, even though you weren't poded, but because you can be poded, kol ha-omed liftos kipodi dami, that since it stands to be redeemed, we treat it as though it's redeemed to the extent that it's considered to have a shasa kosher, so that it can be mitame tumas ochlin. And therefore we'll say, so you see that Reb Shimon's shita is that by a parah aduma it's mitame tumas ochlin, since once it's slaughtered and it's lying there as meat, it has the potential to be poded. Therefore, we'll treat it as though it was poded, so that it has a shasa kosher and it can be mitame tumas ochlin. So therefore, we should say the same thing by this wheat that was harvested, even if you were makdish it when it was still connected to ground. But once you harvest it, since you have the potential to be poded, according to the shita that says that you can be poded even when it's tahor, so we should treat it as though it was poded, to the extent that it should be considered like it has a shas hakosher, so that it can be mitame tumas ochlin. Cheva, what do you think about this daf? What do you think about daf kuf beis? We're about 20 minutes into the daf. We've done about like maybe a few lines on daf kuf aleph mid beis. This is we're mamish. We're in for it. We're committed. So says the Gemara, not a good comparison. Not a good comparison because hachi ashta bishlama para. Look, when it comes to parah aduma, I understand why we'll consider it like it is redeemed, because it's a mitzvah. It would be a mitzvah to redeem it. Para ha-omed is livdosi she'im matza acheres noya imena mitzvah livdosa. Because by parah aduma, if you come across, even after you slaughtered the parah aduma, you come across a different red heifer that is a redder heifer, or whatever, it's just a better one, or whatever it is, you say, wait, that is a better parah aduma. So it's a mitzvah to offer the better one, and what you would do is you'd be poded the one that you already slaughtered, transfer its kedusha onto money, and then buy this other parah aduma and offer that one. So therefore, since it is dafka mitzvah to be poded this parah aduma if you find a better one, so that's why we'll treat it as if it was already redeemed, since there's a mitzvah to redeem it, and we can say, even though you didn't redeem it, but still it's enough to consider it like it has shasa kosher, like it was redeemed to the extent that it has shasa kosher, and it will be mitame tumas ochlin. So again, also bishlama para ha-omed is livdosi. I understand why we say that a paraduma stands to be poded, she'im motza acheres noya imeno, that if you find a nicer paraduma, mitzvah livdosa, there's a mitzvah to be poded this one in order to buy the other one. Elo hane menachos, but when it comes to this mincha, mitzvah livdosan. What, is there any mitzvah to be poded this mincha? When you were makdish the grain when it was still connected to the ground, and then you harvested it, and you have the potential to be poded, but there's no mitzvah to be poded this grain, and therefore we won't consider it like it's already been redeemed, and that's why it's not mitame tumas ochlin. Frag the Gemara, v'ha lon. Let's maybe have a look at this brisa of Reb Shimon from yesterday. If we go back about 25 lines or so, where it says Meisvei in the middle of the line, about halfway through the daf, it says Meisvei, Reb Shimon, it says Reb Shimon, Yesh no sir, Shir mitame tumas ochlin, that there's no sir that can contract tumas ochlin, v'yesh noser, and there's noser, leftover korban meat, she'eno, or even any leftover korban, she'eno mitame tumas ochlin, that is not mitame tumas ochlin. So some noser is mitame tumas ochlin, some noser is not mitame tumas ochlin. Okay, it's that how so? Lon lifnei zrika. So if the meat stayed overnight untouched, lifnei zrika, and there was no zrikas adam. There had not yet been zrikas adam. Eino mitame tumas ochlin. Well then, if there was no zrikas adam, it was never permitted, it never had a shas kosher, therefore it's not mitame tumas ochlin. Le'achar zrika, but if there was zrikas adam, and then the korban was just left overnight, so there was a shas kosher, so mitame tumas ochlin. So it will be mitame tumas ochlin. So we mentioned in that brisa, no sir. The reason why I'm going through this brisa is because all the elements in it are going to be on today's daf. So therefore, if we're not familiar with it, we're not going to know what we're talking about. So we just mentioned no sir. So Reb Shimon says sometimes no sir can be mitame tumas ochlin and sometimes not. Ufigel, when it comes to pigel of an animal, whether it's kachim kalim, bein bekachim kachim, bein bekachim kalim, eino mitame tumas ochlin, there is no tumas ochlin. We're going to have to explain what that means. Okay, so he says, so what have we seen? That by Reb Shimon says that when it comes to noser, sometimes there is tumas ochlin, sometimes there's not. When it comes to pigel, there's not tumas ochlin, whether it's kachim or kachim kalim. Pigel b'mincha mitame tumas ochlin. And Reb Shimon had said that when it comes to pigel by mincha, there is tumas ochlin, which was the whole question that we had asked yesterday on Reb Oshai. Reb Oshai said that Reb Shimon says by pigel by mincha, there's no tumas ochlin. Yet we see in this price that there is tumas ochlin. So that was the answer that we gave. It depends if he was makdish it while it was still connected to the ground or afterwards, etc. That was the brisa. The brisa where Reb Shimon is talking about noser, where he says sometimes it is mitame tumas ochlin, sometimes it's not. He mentions pigel. Bein bekachim, he says that it's not mitame tumas ochlin, and he had said by mincha that it is pigel by mincha is mitame tumas ochlin. So now, getting back to lina in that brisa. V'ha lon, what about lina? Lifnei zrika, that if there was no zrikas adam, right? The way that we are understanding this is to mean that you shechted the korban, and you simply didn't do the zrikas adam. Came the nighttime, and there was possibilina, there was never any zrikas adam. Because there was no zrikas adam, it was never permitted to be eaten. There was never any shasa kosher. Right, it's a korban chatas. If there's no zrikas adam, the kohanim can't eat the meat. So there was never shasa kosher, and therefore it's not mitame tumas ochlin. Ve'alon, when it comes to lon, lifnei zrika, when there hasn't been zrikas adam, the mitzvah lemizruke. Now here's the thing: zrikas adam, it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam, to offer korbanos. Zrikas adam is the key element there. It's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam. V'ibai zarak, and he could have done zrikas adam. V'katane de'ein mitame tumas ochlin. You understand the question? The question is, if you slaughter a korban, let's say a korban chatas, so we should say that even though you didn't do the zrikas adam, since it's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam, and he could have done zrikas adam, we should treat it as though he did zrikas adam, and there should be a shasa kosher, and therefore it should be mitame tumas ochlin. Oh, wow, what a daf. I told you it was going to be hard. Told you it was going to be thorough. Wow. Told you it was going to be a grind. Oof. Again, ve'alon, when it comes to lina, lifnei zrika, when there hasn't been zrikas adam, the mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam. V'bayzark, and he could have done zrikas adam. V'katani, the ain mitami tu masochlin, yet it's not mitami tu masochlin. But why? We should treat it as if he did the zrikas. It should be considered like a shasa kosher. It should be mitami tu masochlin. Hacha b'may skin and answer the Gemara. Shloisa shows bayom lemizukei. Okay, we're saying it's talking about a situation where Imamish slaughtered the korban mamish at the end of the day. There pashut was no opportunity to do zrikas adam, so therefore it was impossible to do zrikas adam, and there was no zrikas adam. There was no possibility of doing zrikas adam, and therefore there was no shatsa kosher, and therefore it's not mitam tumas ochlin. Okay, fine, but if that's the case, then obviously we're going to point out that avaloisa lo shows bayom. If there would have been time to do zrikas adam, what would we say? Mitame tumas ochlin. Sounds like then we would say that if there was time in the day, even though he didn't do zrikas adam, we'll treat it as though he did do the zrikas adam, to the extent that there should be considered a shasa kosher, it should be mitami tumas ochlin. Adetani lon leachar zrika mitami tumas ochlin. When it says in the brisa that if there was zrikas adam and now there's a shasa kosher, and then right, because zrikas adam you can now eat the meat, and then it became possible lina, we would say that it's mitami tumas ochlin since there was a shasa kosher. But wait, lifzog b'didei bamid varmum. Let's say so now with this new information, important information, that should be included in the brisa. Bamid varmamurim shelo aisa shows bayom. When do we say that it's not mitami tumas ochlin? When there was no time left in the day to do zrikas adam, and therefore there was no zrikas adam, there was no shasa kosher, it's not mitami tumas ochlin. Aval oisalo shows bayom, but if there was time in the day to have done zrikas adam, mitame tumas ochlin. Well then, if there was enough time in the day to have done zrikas adam, we would consider it as though the zrikas adam was done to the extent that it would be considered like it has a shasa kosher, and it should be mitami tumas ochlin. Hachinami ka'amar lon ka'amar, yes, that's exactly what it's saying. Lon kodem sheyera'eh lizrika. If the lina happened, if the meat stayed overnight, and there was no opportunity to have done zrikas adam, it was right at the end of the day, there was no opportunity to have done zrikas adam, there was never shasa kosher, eino mitame tumas ochlin, then there will be no tumas ochlin. Le'achar sheyera'eh lizrika, however, if the lina was after it was fit to have done zrika, if you slaughtered the korban and there was an opportunity, there was time to do zrikas adam, mitame tumas ochlin, it will be considered like there was a shasa kosher, and it will be mitame tumas ochlin. Okay, fine. So that was when it comes to lun. I'm going to take a shluck of tea and then we'll talk about pigel. Now pigel, the pigel, bein b'kotche kotche, bein b'kotchem kalim. Okay, now Reb Shimon had also said in that price, as we read, that when it comes to pigel, whether by kotche kotche, whether by kotchem kalim, so we had said in the Mishnah, in that brisa, that there's no tumas ochlin, right? So if you have, let's say, let's say kotche kotche, we've been talking about a korban chatas, let's talk about a korban chatas. So you slaughter the korban. We're going to be talking about exactly what it means right now. But let's say you slaughtered the korban. Well, let's not even talk. Yeah, let's talk about you slaughtered the korban. Yeah, we're going to talk about what exactly pigel has got steps. But you slaughtered the korban with machshavas chutz zmano. So there was never shas akosher. It was immediately puzzle. So there's never shas akosher. So we're saying whether we're talking about a korban chatas, whether we're talking about korban shlamim, i.e. whether it's kotche kotchem, whether it's kotchem kalim, whether kotche kotchem, kotchem kalim, there's no tumas ochlin. Now, but mitzvah pigel bein b'kotche kotchem, bein b'kotchem kalim, the mitzvah lemizrukei v'ibai zarik v'katoni denu matame tumas ochlin my lab the pigel b'zrika. So we want to assume right now that what was the pigel? Not like I was saying that it's b'shchita, but rather What if the shechita was done A-OK? The Kabbalah, the Holacha, A-OK. But the Zrikas Adam, you have a Korban Chatas, so you did the shechita great, you did the Kabbalah great, you did the Holacha great. Now you're up to Zrikas Adam. You do the Zrikas Adam, Machshavas Chutz Lizmano, Pigel, and Reb Shimon is saying in the Brisa, Pigel bein b'kochim kochim, bein b'kochim kalim. There's no tumas ochlin, but I don't understand. Why is there no tumas ochlin? Since you did the shechita kosher, you did the Kabbalah kosher, you did the Holacha kosher, it's now time to do Zrikas Adam. And as the Gemara points out, the mitzvah the mizukeh, it's a mitzvah to do the Zrikas Adam. The Bai Zarek, and he can do the Zrikas Adam. So we should consider it as though he did do the Zrikas Adam, and that it has a Shas kosher, and it should be Metame Tumas Ochlin, such that when he then later does the actual Zrikas Adam with Machshavas Chutz Lizmano, already had a Shas kosher, and therefore it should be Metame Tumas Ochlin. And yet, we're saying it's not mitame tumas ochlin. My love, the pigel b'zrika. We're saying that, and let's assume that it's talking about even when the pigel is b'shas zrika sadam. And we're saying that it's not mitame tumas ochlin, right? Pigel bein b'kochim kochim, bein b'kochim kalim. There's no tumas ochlin, but why not? Shouldn't we say that since the shechita was kosher, the Kabbalah was kosher, Holacha was kosher, it's now time to do Zrikas Adam. We should consider it as though there was Zrikas Adam, because it's a mitzvah to do Zrikas Adam. We should consider it as though there was Zrikas Adam, and there was a Shasa kosher, and it should be Metami Tumas Ochlin. Yet we're saying that it's not. By the way, Mazel Tov, we got up to Kuf Bey, we got up to today's daf, after about a half an hour. Or, Lo de Pigel B'Shchita. No, that Brisa or Reb Shimon says that there's no tumas. It's not in the time of tumas ochlin. By pigel, by kochim, it's talking about where the pigel was by the shechita. That you shechted the korban with machshavas chutz lizmano milichatchila, it was immediately puzzle. There was never a shasa kosher. So lo de pigel b'shchita aval, okay, so therefore what? Pigel b'zrika, okay, so it sounds like we're saying though that if the shchita was kosher, Kabbalah was kosher, Holacha was kosher, and now we're up to zrika, my achinami de metame tumas ochlin. So we'll say that then it would be metame tumas ochlin, because once you get up to the zrika and everything's kosher so far, we'll consider it as though there was zrikas hadam, and therefore we'll consider like, since it stands to be zrikad, as though it was zrikad, and there is a shasa kosher, and it should be mitame tumas ochlin. Adatani pigel b'mincha. Well, then the Brisa then continued and talked about pigel b'mincha mitame tumas ochlin. It said that by pigel, by a mincha, it would be tame tumas ochlin. So liflog bedida. Well, let's say bamed v'mamurim. Wait, when it comes to pigel by korbanis. Let's say the pigel b'shchita, that when do we say that by pigel by animals, it is not mitame tumas ochlin? When the pigel was b'shchita, there was never a shasa kosher, so it's not mitame tumas ochlin. Aval, but pigel b'zrika, if the pigel was by the zrika sadam, where once you did the shchita properly, the Kabbalah, the Holacha properly, and it was ra'ui lizrok, it would be considered like it was zrika properly, and a shasa kosher would be mitame tumas ochlin. So mitame tumas ochlin. So why don't we say that? So it says the Gemara, pigel b'mincha, it's tichale, well, we needed to learn about pigel b'mincha, the afagav the pigel b'kmitza, the komes b'mincha k'shchita dami, afilu achi mitami tumas ochlin, hol v'aisa lo shasa kosher me'ikaro. Wow. The thing is, when it comes to the chiddush, we needed to teach the chiddush about the korban mincha. What about the korban mincha? Well, we said in that brisa that when it comes to pigel by a mincha, we said that when it comes to pigel by mincha, it is mitame tumas ochlin. We said that by pigel by mincha, it is mitame. Right? The Brisa had said, Reb Shimon says that pigel by a mincha is mitame tumas ochlin. But we said by kochim kadnu is not mitame tumas ochlin, but by mincha it is mitame tumas ochlin. And the chiddush there is that if you remember, this, I think this came up already in Zvachim, certainly came up in Menachos, the parallel between shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and zrika, remember that? And kmitza, nisina bekli, hagasha, and aktara by a mincha. Remember this? This takes us back a few months. So there's a parallel that kmitza by a mincha is like shrita by an animal. Nisina bekli by a mincha is like the kabbalas adam by an animal. Holacha hagasha lemizbeach by a mincha is like holacha of the blood by an animal, and the zrikas adam by the animal is like the aktara of a mincha. So I might think that when it comes to taking the komets, that if the if the komets was scooped up with machshavas chutz lizmanu, so I might think that since the kmitza by a mincha is the equivalent of the shchita by a korban, and we said that by a korban, if the shchita was with machshavas pigol, machshavas chutz lizmanu, by a korban, it would be possible immediately, and there would be no shasa kosher, and it would not be matami tumas ochlin. So I might think that by a mincha as well, that the kmitza, the scooping up, which is the equivalent, right, the mincha equivalent of shchita, I might think that if the scooping up was with machshavas chutz lizmanu, so it would not be matami tumas ochlin. So we say that nonetheless it is matami tumas ochlin, since we explained that the brisa where it's matami tumas ochlin is talking about where when it was harvested, where you were not yet makdish it when it was still connected to the ground, you harvested it, and therefore it had a shasa kosher, and only then were you makdish it as a mincha. So since initially milchatchila it had a shasa kosher, so therefore it's matami tumas ochlin, even though when you then designate it as a mincha and you scooped it up with machshavas chutz lizmanu, still it would be matami tumas ochlin, since before you had designated it as a mincha, it was it could have been any, you could have eaten it, whatever, it had a shasa kosher then. So the brisa needed to teach us dafka that by a korban mincha, by the kmitza, even by kmitza of a korban mincha, it would still be considered like it had a shasa kosher milichatchila, and it would be nonetheless mitame tumas ochlin by pigol of a mincha, even by the kmitza. Holy smokes! Okay, wow. What have we done? Wow, that was a journey so far. We're just getting started. Now, what have we done so far? What we had done so far is that at the end of the daf yesterday, we had said that when Rabbi Oshaya says that according to Reb Shimon, pigol by a mincha is not mitami tumas ochlin, so that was when you were makdish it when it was still connected to the ground. When you were makdish it when it was still connected to the ground. And since you were makdish it when it was still connected to the ground, it never had a shasa kosher. We asked, but wait a second. According to the opinion, according to the version of Rabbi Oshaya, who says that Reb Shimon, who says that, according to the version of Rabbi Oshaya, who holds like Shmuel, that you could be podeh the mincha before it's in the klisharis, even when it's tahor. Well, according to that version, even if you were makdish the grain when it was still connected to the ground, once you harvest it, since you can be podeh it, we should treat it as though it was poded, and we brought a raya from the para aduma, from the fact that we say that the para aduma is going to be considered like it was poded, even though it wasn't, since you could potentially be poded in favor of a better para aduma. To which we said, no, the para aduma is different than the grain, because the para aduma, there's a mitzvah to be poded it in favor of a better one, but the grain, there's no mitzvah to be poded. Because there's no mitzvah to be poded, we won't consider it like it's been poded, and that's how we can explain that there was never a shasa kosher, since it was never poded, there's no mitzvah to be poded, there won't be considered like it's a shasa kosher, and it will not be mitami tumas ochlin. That's how we will explain Rab Oshaya. Along the way, then we ask questions about lan and zrikas adam, by lina, by pigol, by how it applies to menachos, by pigol, by menachos. So we asked all sorts of questions, but the initial question in the immediate sense was how it relates to Rabbi Oshaya's assertion that according to Rabbi Shimon, when it comes to pigol by a mincha, there would be no tumas ochlin, and that is when you were makdish it when it was still connected to the ground. Wow. Now we are going to see a shita of Rav Ashi, who disagrees with this notion that kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami. Right? We were just assuming that when it comes to zrikas adam, since it's a mitzvah, right? For example, we said that if you shecht a korban, let's say korban chatas, and there was the potential to have done zrikas adam, but you didn't do zrikas adam, then it became possible lina. We will say that it would be considered like there was a shasa kosher, and it would be mitam tumas ochlin, since there's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam. We'll consider it like the zrikas adam was done, and therefore it's considered like it has a shasa kosher. It will be mitam tumas ochlin. Rav Ashi disagrees. Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi Amrisa l'shmaita kamed Rav Nachman. I said this over to Rav Nachman. Now, as Tosfos points out, that doesn't make sense. Rav Nachman was no longer alive when Rav Ashi was alive. Tosfos points out that Rava was a Talmud of Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman, the Gemara, he points us to a Gemara in Masechta Moed Kain, which says that Rava was there when Rav Nachman passed away. I think that's what it said. The Rava was there. It was certainly Rav Nachman came to Rava in a dream after he passed away. Anyways, so Rav Nachman had passed away in Rava's lifetime. The Gemara in Kedushin, as we've quoted a few times, says that Rava, the day that Rava died, Rav Ashi was born. Clearly, Rav Ashi did not live at the same time of Rav Nachman. So Tosfos suggests it could be a reference to Rav Kahana, which, by the way, Tosfos also points out that there were two Rav Kahanas. One was a Talmud of Rav. We are not talking about that Rav Kahana, because that Rav Kahana lived in the same time as Rav Nachman lived. Rather, there was a later Rav Kahana. So we're either talking about this Rav Kahana, also we're going to see on Daf Kuf and Beis a similar dialogue with Rav Ashi and a later Rav Kahana. Alternatively, he suggests, if you want, it could also be Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, who was a Talmud of Rava, and that could have worked. Anyways, Rav Ashi, Rav Nachman. We'll stick with Rav Nachman just because it's what's written here, but it can't actually be Rav Nachman. Maybe it's Rav Kahana, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, whatever you like. But I'm just going to stick to the text nonetheless. We said what we have to about it. Rav Ashi says Rav Ashi, Rav Nachman. So says Rav Nachman. Rav Ashi says, I said this before, Rav Nachman. Now, afilu tema lon mamish. Okay, even when it comes to lon mamish, which means that there was time in the day to have done zrikas adam, but the zrikas adam did not happen, and it became possible, and there was no zrikas adam. Vafilu tema de pigel bizrika, and you can also say that when it comes to pigel bizrika, that when you did the zrikas adam, right? So say korban chatas, you did the zrikas adam mechshavus chutz zmanu. We would say that there is no tumas ochlin. Ibai parik aminan, ibai zarik lo aminan. Okay. So, okay, we had asked all these questions a few minutes ago, right? That, well, if we're going to say that whenever there's a mitzvah, we'll consider like it's done, right? We said that since that by paraduma, there's a mitzvah to redeem the paraduma when there's a better one. So if we'll consider it like it was redeemed, we'll say, well, if that's the case, since there's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam, we should consider it like the zrikas adam was done. And we said, oh yeah, well, let's talk when it's not mitam tumas ochlin, it's talking about when there was no time to have done zrikas adam. So all the way at the end of the day. And it says Rav Ashi, no. If there was no zrikas adam, then there was never a shasa kosher. We're not going to consider it as if there was zrikas adam. So if you slaughtered a korban chatas and you just never did zrikas adam, there was time to do zrikas adam, but you didn't do it. If you didn't do the zrikas adam, so then there's no shasa kosher. We're going to talk about this more in a few minutes. But, right. We can even talk about it now. Why not? We're going to talk about it more. We're going to talk about me'ila in a second. So, anyways, you have a korban chatas. From the time that you designate a korban chatas as a korban chatas, we'll probably talk about this more in a minute when we talk about me'ila. But anyways, when from the time that you designate a korban chatas as a korban chatas, so then it is, also you can't get any benefit from it. You certainly can't eat it. Then you bring it to the Beis HaMikdash, you slaughter it. You do zrikas adam. The doing of the zrikas adam is what allows the kohanim to eat to burn the emurim and to eat the meat. So long as there was no zrikas adam, I don't care whether you could have done zrikas adam. If you didn't do zrikas adam, then there was no shas heter l'kohanim. There was never a shas kosher, and it will not be matame tumas ochlin. Now you're going to say, but wait, what about the fact that when it comes to para aduma, since there's a mitzvah to be poded, we treat it as if it was poded. Shouldn't we say here that since there's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam, we should consider it as though there was zrikas adam? No, there's a difference. Since being poda an animal doesn't require any action, my understanding, this is how I understand it, is basically if you have some money there, you could just, all you have to do is say, the kedusha of this para aduma is being transferred to that money. You don't have to do anything, you have to say something. It's not a mice, it's a dibur. So in that case, we'll say, okay, we'll treat it as if, right? It doesn't require any activity, any action, any mice. So we'll say, okay, it's considered like it's already podek. Not the case by zrika. Zrika requires us to do something, to do zrikas adam. We won't say that since it's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam, we'll consider it like the zrikas adam was zrikas adam, then therefore it was a shasa kosher, there's b'tamid tumas ochlin. Rav Ashi says that if the zrikas adam was not yet done, then there was no shasa kosher, and it's not b'tamid tumas ochlin. And therefore, Rashi will say when it comes to lina, if you slaughtered the korban chatas, let's say, and you did not do zrikas adam, there was time to do zrikas adam, but you didn't do it, and then the meat became pasul belina, it would be considered like it would not, since you did not do zrikas adam, and it becomes pasul belina, there was never a shasa kosher, because there was no zrikas adam, and therefore, it will not be mitam tumas ochlin. And similarly, by pigul, if you do the shchita properly, you do the kabbalas adam properly, you do the halachas adam properly, but then when it came to the zrikas adam, you did zrikas adam with machshavas chutz lizmano, there was never a shasa kosher, since the zrikas adam is what's going to be matir, is what's going to make it be kosher. But the zrikas adam was done with machshavas chutz lizmano. We're not going to say that, well, it's considered like the zrika was done. When the zrika was done, it was done with machshavas chutz lizmano. It's pasul. There was never a shas kosher, and it will not be metame tumas ochlin. So says Rav Ashi, he takes things simply that if you did the zrikas adam, then there's a shas kosher. If you didn't do the zrikas adam, then there's no shas kosher. And there's a difference between being poda with your mouth, right, verbally, and doing zrikas adam, which is an actual action. We'll consider the being poded like it has been poded, since there's a mitzvah to be poded, and it's only a dibur. Even though there's mitzvah to do zrikas adam, it's only considered zrikas adam once it has in fact been zrikas adamd. Okay, great. Meisvei, we have a question from Meila. Now, let's read it for a minute. This question comes from the first Mishnah in Masechta Meila, where it says, Klal Omer Rabbi Yoshua lays down a rule when it comes to Meila, and that rule is, Kol sha'aisa lo shas heter lakohanim ein mayalin ba, v'chol shelo aisa lo shas heter lakohanim mayalin ba. This is a principle by Meila, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that if I go up to Sarah the U and say, I choose you to be a korban chatas. Korban chatas is kodshei kodshim. It's osur ba'anah, and if you get anah from Sarah the U, you shear its wool or whatever, you're chayav a korban osher me'ilos. There is a din me'ilah by Sarah the U. And that din me'ilah remains until there's a shas kosher, a shas heter lekohanim. What does that mean? It means zrikas adam. Once Sarah the U is brought to the Beis Hamikdash and it is shchitad, it is slaughtered, and there's zrikas adam, so now there's a shas heter lekohanim. Now the kohanim can eat it. Before that point, the kohanim cannot eat it. That would be getting, nobody can eat it. He's getting hanah. That would be me'ilah. Once there's zrikas adam, that allows the emurim to be burnt to the mizbech. It allows the kohanim to eat it. That's what's called the shas heter lekohanim. The kohanim can now eat it. The me'ilah is expired. There's no longer any me'ilah. You can now get hanah. You can eat the meat. So we say, so there's halacha when it comes to me'ilah, says Rabbi Yeshua that there's the general rule by me'ilah is that once there's a shas heter l'kohanim, once the korban has been permitted for the kohanim to eat it, there's no longer me'ilah. But in a scenario where there never was a shas heter l'kohanim, where Sarah the U never became permitted to the kohanim, well then the me'ilah never went away and it will still have a din me'ilah. Okay. So now, Meisveh, we have a contradiction that we have from the first Mishnah, Masechta Me'ilah. Klal Omer Rabbi Yeshua, that Rabbi Yeshua says, here is the rule when it comes to Me'ilah. Kol sha'aiselo sha'aseta l'kohanim, that once Sarah the U becomes mutter to the Kohanim, with Zrikas Adam, Ein mo'alim ba, there's no longer Me'ilah. Me'ilah is gone now. You can enjoy it. Eat Sarah the U. But if something happened that made it possible and it was never permitted to the Kohanim, well then the status of Me'ilah, the din of Me'ilah persists. What's an example of Shas Heter l'Kohanim where it became permitted to the Kohanim? So I'm going to explain it simply right now. We'll get into the details in just a moment. So Shas Heter l'Kohanim, let's say what it means is that, well, Sarah the U was brought to the Beis Hamikdash. It was slaughtered. Sarah the U was slaughtered. And there was Zrikas Adam. And because there was Zrikas Adam, now the Kohanim can eat Sarah the U. And even if then it becomes Pasul Belina, or it becomes Tameh, or it was Yotze, if it was taken outside of the Heichel, outside of the Azara, there would be no din me'ilah because after the Zrikas Adam it was already considered mutter. There was a Shas Heter l'Kohanim, and even if it later became possible, or once it was Shas Heter l'Kohanim, there's no longer din me'ilah. Even if it becomes possible later on, it doesn't matter. The Shas Heter l'Kohanim is no longer din me'ilah. Ve'ezo I shelo aiselo Shas Heter l'Kohanim. And what would be examples of it was never permitted to the Kohanim, and therefore the din me'ilah persists? For example, if Sarah the U was slaughtered with machshavas chutz lizmana or machshavas chutz l'mkoma, it was immediately possible. There was never shas heter l'kohanim. V'shekiblu psulim v'zarku dama. Or if a zar, for example, does kabbalas adam or zrikas adam, completely possible, never permitted to the kohanim, and the me'ilah will persist. Now, here is where our Gemara approaches this Mishnah. That we had said, that if there is a psul of lina, or it becomes tamei or yotze, that would be considered that there was a shas heter l'kohanim. That there was a shas heter l'kohanim. My love, lona mamish. So let's say that it's talking about lona mamish, which means, so it's a kasha and Rav Ashi. Why is it a kasha and Rav Ashi? Because what this means is that there was no zrikas adam. What we want to say is that Sarah the U was slaughtered, and there was no zrikas adam, and it became possible belina without having any zrikas adam, and still we're considering it to be a shas heter l'kohanim. Since there's a mitzvah to do zrikas adam, we'll consider like there was zrikas adam, and therefore we'll consider like there was a shas heter l'kohanim, and therefore there's no din me'ilah. That's what the Gemara wants to suggest. If that's the case, that would be a kasha and Rav Ashi, because Rav Ashi says you actually have to do the zrikas adam. We won't consider it like the zrikas adam has been done, since it's a mitzvah to do it. You have to do it. But we want to suggest now that when we say that lina is an example of shas heter l'kohanim, we want to assume that that's even if the zrikas adam was not done, but since it could have been done, we'll treat it like it was done, and therefore it's considered like there was a shas heter l'kohanim. There's no din me'ilah. The ibai havazarik, who, and here he could have done zrika. V'katoni de'ein mo'alin, and we're saying that there's no din me'ila. We're saying that there's no din me'ila because it's considered like there's a shaset l'kohanim, even though the zrikas hadam was never done, but it could have been done, and therefore considering it like it was done, and therefore considering it like there's a shaset l'kohanim, and there's no din me'ila anymore. Lo, Rav Ashi would answer and say no. V'uya lotzeis v'uya l'tamei. Skip the next two words. No. It's talking about a situation where the zrikas hadam was already zrikas hadam. And when it says yotze, and when it says tamei, it's talking about a situation where when the korban was, right, so it was after zrikas hadam, and the meat was taken out of the azara, and it's possible for yotze alone. I.e., if there wasn't yet zrikas hadam, there would be more than one issue. At least this is how I understand it. That there would be more than one issue. There would be yotze, but there would also be the fact that there was no zrikas hadam done. That's also an issue. But no, we're talking about where the only issue is yotze. That the zrikas hadam was already done, and now you take the meat out of the azara, the issue is yotze. Or if it becomes tamei, the only issue is tamei. The zrikas hadam was already done. Not that there needs to be zrikas hadam and that there was, and it was tamei. So therefore, we're talking about where the zrikas hadam was already done. Skip the next two words. Avalina mamish mai. But 1 second. So you're telling me then that if there was no zrikas hadam, so if there was lina and there was no zrikas hadam, you slaughtered Sarah the U, there was no zrikas hadam, it then became possible lina. So Rav Ashi would argue that it would not be considered a shaset l'kohanim, and there would still be a din me'ila. Hachinami d'mei alin. So you're telling me then that there still would be a din me'ila, Rav Ashi? You're telling me that when it comes to me'ila, if Sarah the U was slaughtered, and there was never, it just kind of ended there was no zrikas hadam, it became possible lina, so it would be considered like there was no shaset l'kohanim, and there would still be a din me'ila. But here's the problem. So you're telling me then that when the Mishnah talks about lina and yotze and tamei, we're talking about where the zrikas hadam was already done, right? So Sarah the U was slaughtered. The zrikas hadam was zrikas hadam. It was therefore at a shaset l'kohanim, and then it becomes possible lina or b'yotze or b'tuma. We're saying since the zrikas hadam was dafka done, there was a shaset l'kohanim. Therefore, there's no din me'ila. But if that's the case, Hai kosha hoya lo shas eter l'kohanim v'kosha lo oisa lo shas eter l'kohanim kosha yesh lo eter l'kohanim ein bo alim ba v'kosha ein lo eter l'kohanim mo al. What did you say? Kosha yesh lo. I'm skipping the word shas. Kosha yesh lo eter l'kohanim ein mo alim ba v'kosha ein lo eter l'kohanim mo alim ba mi ba'ile. Shish. Okay, but the Gemara points out. Okay, Rav Ashi, if what you're saying is correct, that when Rabbi Yoshua is giving examples of shaset l'kohanim, and he says, for example, lun, it's talking about it was a shaset l'kohanim because zrikas hadam was already done. Here's the problem: the lashon Rabbi Yoshua's lashon is kol she'haya la shas kosher. We want to understand this to mean shehaya la, the potential. That there was the potential for shas kosher. You didn't yet do the zrikas hadam, but you were able to do zrikas hadam. That would be considered like there was a shas kosher. That there was the ability to have done zrikas hadam. Then it's considered like there was a shas kosher, and it's not. There's no longer din me'ila. Because if it's talking about where the zrikas hadam was already done, then it would say kosher yesh. Heter l'kohanim, whatever, right? If the zrikas hadam was already done, it wouldn't be kol shehaya, it would be kol sheyesh. It wouldn't be anything that has the ability, the potential to be have a shas heter l'kohanim. No, it would be kol sheyesh. Whenever there is a shas heter l'kohanim, since the zrika was already done. So from the lashon of shehaya, we want to say that it's mashma that the zrikas hadam was not yet done, and yet we're considering it like it was done. So that it's considered like a shas heter l'kohanim, and there's no din me'ila. Do 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 ba ba da ba da ba bum 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 ba dum bum bum ba dum. So I go. So right, new. So avalina mamish my ochinam de my alba. So then, frankly, Gemara. Right, I'm reading this again. About 10-15 lines from the bottom. Hi, kol shehayalo shas heter l'kohanim. When it says kol shehayalo, which implies that it has the potential to have a shas heter l'kohanim. The zrikas adam was not yet done, but it could be done. And if it could not have been done, I guess maybe it was at the very end of the day. But what it should say is kol sheyesh lo heter l'kohanim, anything that is mutter l'kohanim, because the zrikas adam was done according to Rav Ashi. Ein mo'alim, but then there's no din me'ila. And if there isn't a shas heter l'kohanim, because the zrikas adam has not yet been done, mo'alin ba, so then there is still a din me'ila. Mi ba'ile, that's what it should have done. Should have said. It could have said. It should have said kol sheyesh and kol she'ein, but it doesn't. It says kol shehayev and kol she'lo hayev. So Rav Ashi says fine. Rav Ashi concedes that is a fair argument. That the lashon of Rabbi Yoshua in the first Mishnah of Me'ila is mashma that if, as long as there's potential for zrikas adam, even if the zrikas adam was not done, it would be considered like there's a shas heter l'kohanim. However, Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, Me'ila atuma karamis. Rav Ashi says, wait, Me'ila and tuma are different things. Rav Ashi says, look, I'm commenting on tumas ochlim. You're bringing me a question from Me'ila. Those are different. How come? So again, Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi, Me'ila atuma karamis. You're asking me a question on tumas ochlin from Me'ila. Look, Me'ila mishum kedusha v'lav kedusha hi. Look, when it comes to Me'ila, it's about, does it still have this kedusha or not? Once you're metame, once you're makdish sarah de'u as a korban chatas, it has kedusha, and it will have a din Me'ila until the din Me'ila goes away, until that kedusha goes away. And that kedusha goes away. Once there's the potential for zrikas adam, that's enough for it to be considered like the kedusha is gone and there's no longer a din me'ila. The pakala kedusha say once the kedusha goes away after shchita, when there's a potential for zrikas adam, b'may hadra rach bala, it's not coming back. Tuma mishum uchla v'lav uchla hi. Tumas ochlin, however, is a different story. It's about, is it considered ochel or not? If it's considered ochel, then it can have tumas ochlin. If it's not considered ochel, then not. And kol eicha, basically skip 2 or 3 lines. Delo mashvila uchla, and as long as it has not yet been made into ochel, lo metame tumas ochlin. Now, in order for something to be considered ochel, right? So, for example, if we're talking about by lina, if it's going to be considered like there was a shasa kosher, and so that it's going to be considered for mitami tumas ochlin, or by pigol that it's mitami tumas ochlin, for that you actually, Rav Ashi is going to argue, you actually have to do the zrikas adam in order to be matir the ochel, in order for it to be considered ochel to have tumas ochlin. For there you actually have to do the zrikas adam. So those are 2 different things. In order for it to be considered like there isn't this kedusha anymore, and therefore there's no longer a din me'ila, it's enough that there's the potential for zrikas adam. Rav Ashi admits to that, but it says Rav Ashi, I was commenting on tumas ochlin. For someone to be able to be metame tumas ochlin, that actually requires the actual zrikas adam to be matir the meat to be eaten, so that it would actually be considered ochel and to be mitame tumas ochlin. Wow. Okay. We're going to have a shtickle tea and we'll go weiter. How's everybody doing? This must be over an hour already. Oh my gosh, what are we up to? 1 hour and 6 minutes. Sheesh. Chevra, we're just getting started. We're over an hour in. We're still on Kuf Beis Amud Aleph. We still have work to do. I knew this was going to be a doozy. Meisei, we have a kasha. Hamevi Ashim Tali. This is a Mishnah, the first Mishnah in the 5th parak of Masechta Kreisus. Kreisus is going to be a difficult Masechta, I think. I think Kreisus is going to be a difficult Masechta. I'll tell you why. Do you remember the last parak of Masechta, I think Sota? The last parak of, I believe it was, 94 5% sure is Masechta Sota. The last parak of Masechta Sota. By the way, is anybody learning Masechta Sota during Sfiras HaOmer? That's with Masechta Sota. It's 49 daf. So there's like a minig. I think it's maybe Dafka Chabad minig to learn Masechta Sota during Sfiras HaOmer. Al Koponim. So the last 10 daf of Masechta Sota were, for some reason, there was no Tosfos. And they were just these big, difficult pages that had tons of content on them, almost like Horius. Right? I think Krasis is going to be like a Horius kind of thing, but it's twice as long. Big pages full of difficult Kachim content. I think I've never learned Krasis, but that's my impression. Al Koponim, the first Mishnah in the 5th parak of Masechta Krasis teaches us the following: Maybe Asham Tali. Who can tell me what an Asham Tali is? Asham Tali is when you have a suffix kares, meaning a korban chatas is if you mechal Shabbos b'shogeg by accident. So you bring a korban chatas. You ate chaylev by accident, right? You take a big spoonful of chaylev, and then somebody says, "Hey, that was chaylev." You say, "Dagnabit." You bring a korban chatas. But what if there was one piece of chaylev and one piece of shuman? One piece was mutter, one piece was aser. You ate one of them. You don't know which one it was. 50-50 chance you ate chaylev or you ate shuman. You don't know. So you bring what's called an asham talui. And that will be enough if you never solve this case and you never end up finding out if you actually ate chaylev or shuman. Well, you could just rely on the asham talui to keep any punishment or bad vibes away from you. If at some later point you find out, it turns out that I did in fact eat the chaylev, at that point you have to bring your korban chatas. At that point you know, okay, I know I accidentally ate chaylev, I have to bring korban chatas. In the meantime, while you're not sure, you bring an asham tali. Now, maybe asham tali, so somebody brought an asham tali. V'noda shelo chata, but he gets a message from his friend, bro, you ate the shuman. And he's like, woo, wow, amazing. So he didn't eat chaylev. Now he's got this korban over here. So v'nodelo shelo chata im ad shelo nishchat. If he gets the message from his friend that he ate the shuman rather than the chaylev, and you haven't yet slaughtered the korban, right? Ad shelo nishchat nodelo. Meir says, okay, so just great. You went up to your flock. You said, not Sarah, because it needs to be this Asham Tali is going to be a 2-year-old ram. So Reuven said, Reuven, the ram, you are going to be my Asham Tali. And turns out he gets the message that he ate the shuman. So he brings Reuven the ram back home, and Reuven the ram goes and plays with his friends. Divra Meir, that's Meir's opinion. V'chomam, whereas the Chom say, Yirat she'istov v'yimachem v'yiplu damel v'nedava. So the machlokas between Reb Meir and the Chacham is, what exactly was his intention when choosing Reuven the ram? Reb Meir says that his intention for choosing Reuven the ram was that he's going to offer Reuven the ram as the Asham Tali. He gets the message that he actually ate the shuman. He doesn't need to offer Reuven the ram as Asham Tali. So, okay, he doesn't need Reuven the ram anymore. He chose it only as an Asham Tali. It's not being offered as an Asham Tali. Send Reuven the ram back to play with his friends. The Chachamim say, no, that actually when, what does Rashi say? Mitosha libo nokfo, gomer makadishla. Al chato, no, he accidentally, he's not sure that if he may have eaten chaylev. And he feels really bad about it. And when he sets aside Reuven the ram, he's not saying I'm setting aside Reuven the ram as ma'ashim tali. He's setting aside Reuven the ram as a korban. He's not getting into the details of only if I need to use it. He's setting aside Reuven the ram. And therefore, when it turns out that he did not eat the chaylev, turns out false alarm, he ate the shuman, but he had already designated Reuven the ram, so he's not going to offer it as an asham tali because he doesn't need to bring an asham tali. But at the same time, he doesn't just bring back Reuven the ram to play with his friends. Rather, yes, you bring back Reuven the ram to play with his friends, but you wait until Reuven the ram gets a mum. When it gets a mum, you'll sell Reuven the ram and use that money and donate it to the pushke in the Beis HaMikdash, where the money from that pushke goes to the Kayetz HaMizbeach offerings. Right, so Yirach Yisrael, send Reuven the ram back to his friends until he gets a mum, and at that point, V'yimacher, you'll sell him V'yiplu Domov Linadava, and his money, the money from the sale will be put in the Kayetz HaMizbeach pushke in the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Eliezer has an interesting shita. Yikarev, offer it as an Asham Tali. Offer it as an Asham Tali. Because she'im eino ba'al chet zet, areyu ba'al chet acher. Look, eina chinami, seems you ate the shuman. You don't actually need to bring the Asham Tali this time. But you probably need to bring an Asham Tali for something else. So, go ahead, bring the Asham Tali. Reb Eliezer, 2 Mishnayos later, says you can bring an Asham Tali every day if you want. Because people, we probably sin all the time. He considers the Asham Tali to be a kind of an Asham Nedava. And therefore, right, the Mishnah mentions Babble ben Buto would bring a Asham Tali every single day of the year. Just, he was talked out of it on the day after Rosh. The Chacham talked him out of it the day after Yom Kippur. Because Imam was just after Yom Kippur, you haven't really sinned yet. So the day after Yom Kippur, right, you give yourself a day off. But Babble ben Buto would bring an Asham Tali every single day. Rabbi Eliezer says it's like a kind of Nedava. So anyways, Rabbi Eliezer says even if you get the message that you didn't need the Shuman, you could bring it anyways. No big deal. Okay. So again, Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer, Yikariv, you can offer the Asham Tali nonetheless. Shem Einu Ba'al Chet Zeh, okay, if it's not going to come for the Chelev, Areyu Ba'al Chet Acher, you maybe you did a different sin, they have to bring a korban, just bring the korban, it's not a big deal. Now, Misha Nishchat, if the Asham Tali has already been slaughtered, no delo, he gets the message that he ate the shuman and he doesn't need to offer it. And now you have the blood in the vessel. Hadam yishafech, spill out the dam into the ama, in the azara, into the stream, and let it just flow out of the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'abasu yisarif, and you'll push it, just burn the meat. There's nothing to do with it. Lizrok hadam, but if you already did the zrikas hadam, you hadn't yet gotten the message that you ate the shuman. So you did the shchita, the zrikas hadam, which is the most important part of the korban. At that point, you were still besafik. You didn't know that you ate the shuman. You still thought that you may have eaten chelef, which is just a classic Asham Tali. So it was an Asham Tali that was offered kosherly. So now what about the meat? Well, eat. You offered the Asham Tali when you were besafik. The meat is kosher. Is right. Habasu yachel. Eat the meat. The Kohanim can eat the meat. No, givaldi. Now here's the key part. Rabbi Yossi, says Rabbi Yossi, afilu adam bikos yizarek v'habasu yachel. Even if it was post shchita and the dam is still in the vessel, it has not yet been zrikas hadamd. Whereas the Tanakhama says you'll spill it out and burn the meat. You could still do the zrikas hadam. Move ahead, move forward with the zrikas hadam. Do the zrikas hadam, eat the meat. Ve'omar Ravin says Ravin, Reb Yossi b'shittas Reb Shimon Omar, that Reb Yossi agrees with Reb Shimon, the Omar kol ha-omed lizrok dami, that when there's the potential for zrika, it's considered like it has already been zrikad. Right? We said this is a kasha and Rav Ashi. Because Rav Ashi had said that no, by zrikas hadam we don't say kol ha-omed lizrok dami. And yet, here we have a Mishnah where Reb Yossi is saying, go ahead with the zrikas hadam, even though you've already found out that you don't need to be offering the korban. And says Rava that Reb Yossi holds like Reb Shimon that kol ha-omed lizrok dami. To which Rav Ashi would answer, midu taima. Rav Ashi would disagree with Rava and say, that's not the reason for Reb Yossi. Reb Yossi, who says, move ahead with the zrikas hadam, it's not because Reb Yossi holds like Reb Shimon that kol ha-omed lizrok dami. I mean, my Rava, they say that it's so much with Reb Yossi, but Reb Chanina, high new time with Reb Yossi. This is the reason for Reb Yossi. The kasover klei sharis mikadjin es absudin lechatchila likar. that the klisharis, the fact that the blood was already kabbalah, was already received in the klisharis, in a situation like this, where you have the blood in the klisharis, it turns out that actually you don't need to be bringing the korban. In that case, the klisharis will be, what was the lashon? Mikatzin will be mekadesh the blood as a psulin, even though it's possible, meaning it's not like it was like, became tamei or something like that, or became like pasul biyotze. It's a psul that like, it turns out that actually you don't need to offer this korban. In this case, the klisharis will be mekadesh the blood lichatchila likarif, so that you can actually move ahead with it and do the zrikas adam and eat the meat. So Rav Ashi would say this is not a raya to say that kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami. The reason for Rav Asi is for Yosi is because the klisharis will be mikadeshet. Amar le Rav Ashi to Rav Kahana says Rav Ashi to Rav Kahana. So you see over here, we see Rav Ashi to Rav Kahana, which is like what Tosfos wanted to say earlier instead of Rav Nachman. Okay. Amar le Rav Ashi to Rav Kahana mido Amar Reb Shimon. From the fact that Reb Shimon says kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami. Okay, that if we assume that Reb Shimon says kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami, so if you say that, then kol ha-omed lisrof nami kizaruk dami. Well, then we should also say the same thing by Sveifa, that anything that stands to be burned, we should treat it as though it has already been burned. Nosar upara amay mitam tumas ochlin. That being the case, then why would Reb Shimon say that nosar could be mitam tumas ochlin? That para aduma is mitam tumas ochlin. Shouldn't we consider them that since nosar needs to be burned, right? And the para aduma obviously is going to be burned. Since they stand to be burned, we should treat them as if they are burned. Afra ba'almaninu. We should treat them like dirt, like ashes, like they've already been burned. They should not be mitam tumas ochlin. Omar le, to which Rav Ashi responds to Ravina. Wait, was that? No, I'm sorry. Rav Kahana answers Rav Ashi. Chibas HaKodesh machsharten. Oh, it's the specialty that we have towards what's a good word for this? The sensitivity that we show towards Kodesh is what's machshir them to become tamei. Yeah, we should theoretically treat the lina and the paraduma like they're already burnt, and they should not be able to contract tumas ochlin. But because we're talking about kodesh, we go the extra. We're more machmir, and we say that even though we should consider them like they are ash, nonetheless we will say that they will be able to contract tuma, to have kind of a higher standard for kodesh. Ravina to Ravashi says Ravina to Ravashi nehidim ahanyulu chibas hakodesh levsule degufe. Says Ravina to Ravashi, now how far are we going to go with this chibas hakodesh thing to say that the lina and the paraduma are mitam tumas ochlin? Is it to the extent that they become pasul? To say that, okay, fine. So if you add that by lina, that by paraduma, they themselves could contract tumas ochlin and they will become pasul. Okay, that's fine. Or do we say to the extent that they can also now convey tumas ochlin to something else? Meaning, it's one thing to say that they themselves become pasul. Okay. But to then say that not only do they contract tuma, and if they touch something else, then that thing can become tamei even. Do we go that far? Likruye tamei nami lemimne bei rishin v'sheni. Would we also say that they can now convey tuma to something else? Tivshel to buy Rish Lakish. If that's the case, then we should have an answer, or I guess either way, we should have an answer to Rish Lakish's question. Tzrid shel menachos. That when it comes to if you have a little bit of mincha that did not mix with any oil, and it's not moksha l'kabutuma, and then a sheretz falls on it. So mon barishon v'sheni or ein mon barishon v'sheni, should we, because of chibas hakodesh, even though it's not moksha l'kabutuma, nonetheless should we say that this flour which should be considered tummy to be able to transfer tuma? So based on the answer to this question, we should have an answer. So ki mibaya le Reish Lakish d'oraisa ki amrina d'Rabbanan. However, Reish Lakish wanted to know about the oraisa, if we would consider it a Risha and a Sheni. We, however, are only talking about mi de Rabbanan. That because the Chibas HaKodesh, we're talking about mi de Rabbanan, it would become Tamei. Reish Lakish wants to know about the oraisa, so we wouldn't be able to apply the answer to this question to Reish Lakish's. Ooh. Wow, sheesh, how's everybody doing? Wow, this is summed up. Okay, new Mishnah about declaring the intent for a type of mincha. Says the Mishnah, somebody says, I'm going to bring a minchas machbas in like a crepe kind of pan. A fried mincha in a crepe pan. Maybe marcheshes, but he brought a deep fried pan. He brought a mincha in a deep fried mincha. But marcheshes vevi b'machbas. He says he's going to bring a marcheshes, but in practice he brought a machbas. Interesting. So a person says, I'm going to bring a minchas marcheshes, and then he brings a minchas machbas. So we say, thank you for bringing a minchas. Right? He said, what did I say? I don't know what I said, but I'm going to say something new. Start over. He says he's going to bring a minchas machbas. In practice, he brought a minchas marcheshes. So we say, thank you for bringing a minchas marcheshes. You still need to bring a minchas machbas. Meaning, right, there's no problem here. He said, I'm going to bring a minchas machbas. Okay, great. Whether you do that today, tomorrow, whatever, great. You'll bring a minchas machbas. He then proceeded to bring a minchas marcheshes. Thank you for bringing a minchas marcheshes. There's nothing to do with the fact you said you're bringing a minchas machbas. You still have to do that. Okay, great. There's nothing wrong with this marcheshes. Thank you very, very, very much for bringing it. Right, so both are fine. Thank you for bringing the minchas marcheshes. You still do, of course, need to bring a minchas machbas because that's what you said you were going to bring. So again, Homer arei olay minchas b'machbas. If a person says, I'm going to bring a minchas machbas, he then proceeded ve'evi b'marcheshes, he brought a minchas marcheshes. Or if it was fakert, he says, I'm going to bring b'marcheshes ve'evi b'machbas. Great, masha evi, the mincha that he brought, we will gladly accept. Thank you very much. But the fact of the matter is, he hasn't yet brought what he said he's going to bring. He still needs to do that. Now, if, however, what he says is zo le'avi b'machbas, this isarun right here, I am going to be bringing this isarun as a minchas machbas. Ve'evi b'marcheshes, but he brought it as a marcheshes. That's bad. B'marcheshes ve'evi b'machbas, or vice versa. Harezo psula, it's psula, because that is already contradicting what he said he's going to do. He said, I'm going to bring this isarun as a machbas, and he brought this isarun as a marcheshes, or vice versa. That is possible. Ha-omed arei olai shnei esronis lavi b'chli echad. If he says, I am going to bring 2 isaruns as a mincha, and I'm going to bring them in one vessel. I.e., right, as we know, when it comes to a minchas nidava, the default is 1 isarun, but if you want, bring it 2 isaruns, 3 isaruns, 60 isaruns, however many isaruns you want. So he says, I'm going to bring a mincha of 2 isaruns, I'm going to bring them together in one kli, together 2 isaruns. Ve'evi b'shnei kelim, and he brought 2 isaruns in 2 vessels. B'shnei kelim ve'evi b'kli echad, or fakert. He says, I'm going to bring 2 minchas and 2 isaruns in 2 vessels, but he brought 2 isaruns in 1 vessel. Again, he said he's going to bring one thing, he brought something else. Okay, whatever he brought, we will gladly accept. Great, but he still needs to do what he said he was going to do. But if he says elu b'kli echad, if he says these 2 isaruns I'm putting in one kli, ve'evi b'shnei kelim, but he brought it in 2 vessels, or he says these 2 esron I'm going to bring b'shnei kelim in 2 vessels, ve'evi b'kli echad, but he didn't do that, he brought it in 1 vessel. Harei elu psulin. In that case, it's possible because he didn't do what he said he was going to do. Harei olai shnei esronus lavi b'chli echad. If a person says I am going to bring 2 isaruns in 1 vessel, ve'evi b'shnei kelim, and he brought it in 2 vessels. Amru lo b'chli echad nadarta, and he says, wait, but they say to him, wait, but you had made a neder about 1 vessel, v'ikrivam b'shnei kelim, but he nonetheless proceeded to bring them in 2 vessels. Psulin, they are apostle in that case. B'chli echad ksherid. I'm going to read that again. Harei olai shnei esronos. He said, I'm going to bring 2 isaruns, lavi b'chli echad, in 1 kli. Okay. Ve'evi b'shnei kelim, but he brought the 2 isaruns in 2 separate klis. Okay. They said to him, wait, but didn't you make a neder to bring it in one kli, not in two klis. But he nonetheless proceeded. He didn't clarify, oh yeah, I did say I'm going to bring it in one kli, but this is a separate thing. He didn't say that. He just moved ahead, i.e., he acknowledged that the neder was for one kli, but he proceeded nonetheless to do it in two klis. Psulin. He's basically going against what he said he was going to do. But if he did it in one kli, then it's kosher, as he said he was going to do. Hare olai shnei esronis lavi b'shnei kelim. If he says, I'm going to bring two isarons in two vessels, but he brought them only in one vessel. They said to him, wait, b'shnei kelim nadarta. You said you can bring him in two kelim. Hekriva b'shnei kelim. So if he then changes track and he brings them in two kelim, like he said he was going to do ksherin. Nasnu l'kli echad, but if he puts it in one kli, even though the neder was for two klis, kishtei menachos in his arva will treat them like two minchas that got mixed together and they're kosher. What does that mean? Rashi explains what it means is that meaning he said that he's going to bring two isarons in two vessels. He brought them in one vessel and we're saying that it's kosher because as long as the two isarons remain separate, such that you could bring an isaron from this, you could bring a kometz, separate a kometz from this isaron and a kometz from that isaron, and effectively you're keeping them separate even though they're in the same vessel, that is fine. And Rashi says the same would apply to the other cases as well. If he says he's going to bring a vessel, he says I'm going to bring these two isarons in two vessels, but he brings them in one vessel. We said earlier it's possible, but so long as you could still, if they're kept separate, even in one vessel, and you could separate a kometz from each independently, that will be fine. It will be kosher. V'tzricha, says the Gemara, we need both cases. Which both cases? The cases of I'm going to bring in a machvas and he brings in a marcheshes. I'm going to bring two isarons in two vessels and he brings two isarons in one vessel. We need both of those scenarios where he didn't quite do what he said he's going to do. If we only had the machvas and the marcheshes, mishum de omer b'machvas, v'komaisi b'marcheshes, I would say it's possible because he specifically said machvas and he brought in the marcheshes. Avalacha, but 2 verses 1, the ida v'ili b'machvas, where if he says I'm going to bring two isarons and two machvases, but he brought it in one machvas, but at the end of the day he's bringing a mincha and a machvas. Vidi b'marcheshes, or both of them are in a marcheshes, like he said he was going to do. Ema yedei nidro nami yotza, we should say it's okay. Therefore, we had to say no. If he says he's going to bring it in two machvases and he brings it in one machvas, or vice versa, it's going to be a problem as well. And if we only add the two vessels versus one vessel, because he's dividing up what he said he's going to do. He says he's going to bring in two, but he brought in one, or he says he's going to bring in one, he brought in two. But if he says, I'm going to bring it in a machbas, but brought in marcheshes, he's not dividing up his mincha or anything like that. He's bringing one isaron in one kli, like he said he's going to do. Eimalo, maybe I'll say it's okay. Tzricha, we said no. If he says he's going to bring a machbas, he has to bring a machbas, he can't bring a marcheshes. Okay. Tana Rabbanan, the Rabbastad, Masha Evi V'dei Nidro Lo Yotza. So as we said earlier, if he says, I'm going to bring a minchas machvas, and then he brings a minchas marcheshes, we said in that case it's okay, because he's bringing a mincha, but he says to me a machvas, he brought a marcheshes. Okay, great, thanks for bringing the marcheshes. You still have to bring the machvas. The marcheshes is kosher, just you still have to bring the machvas. Now, Reb Shimon, afi de nidro nami yotza. Reb Shimon says, no, all good actually. He says, I'm going to bring a minchas machvas. He brings a minchas marcheshes. That's completely fine. And Rashi says that Reb Shimon disagrees with the whole Mishnah because he says the kelim don't really matter. Honestly, he says machvas, he brings the marcheshes, it's fine. Right? The kelim are not ma'akev. And I think the point would be also, if he says I'm going to bring two and he brings in one, those things are not so important. If he says he's going to bring a mincha, he brings a mincha, it's fine. Zola avi b'machvas, if he says that I'm going to bring this isaron in a machvas and he brings in a marcheshes, we said that's in the Mishnah, we said that's a problem. V'ha Tanya, we learned in a brisa lo kidshum kli sharis. But one second, we learned in a brisa that the kli sharis is not mekadosh. So if he says I'm going to bring this isaron in a machbas, but he brings it in a marcheshes, we said it's a problem. Why? Just take it out of the marcheshes and transfer it into the machbas. What's the big deal? After all, lo kidshum kli sharis. The kli sharis is not mekadosh. Just transfer it. Abaye lo kitchum li karev. No, what it means is the kli sharis is not going to be mekadosh it to the extent that you won't be able to offer it on the mizbeach. Kitchum li pasal, but it would be pasal. I think the point is, if he says he's going to bring in a machvas, he brings a marcheshes, the klishar says the marcheshes is not going to be mekadosh to allow it to be brought in the mizbeach, but it will be possible. V'amar Abai says, Abai lo shanu elo shekvan b'shas neder. When he's saying, I'm going to bring a minchas machvas, and we say, okay, so you have to bring a minchas machvas. That's only when he said it at the time that he made his declaration. But if what he said is, I'm going to bring a mincha, and he doesn't say whether a machvas or a marcheshes, and then at the time that he's separated, that he's taking his isaron of flour, he says, I'm going to bring this isaron as a machvas. Lo, in that case, he's not committed. He doesn't have to bring a machvas, because kasher nadarta, the pasuk says kasher nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha, as you declared in your neder. And therefore, if he declared in his neder, I'm going to bring a minchas machvas, he has to bring a minchas machvas. V'lo kasher efrashta, but if he just said, I'm going to bring a korban mincha, and then when he separates the isar and he says, I'm going to bring this as a machvas, lo kasher efrashta. The pasuk doesn't say that, well, as you're separating the isaron, you have to stick to your word. It doesn't say it. It says kasher nadarta, lo kasher efrashta. Manayim is also stated on Reb Acha Bar Chanina, Reb Asi, Reb Yochanan, Lo Shanu Ela Shekvan B'Shas Neder. It only matters B'Shas Neder, Avol, B'Shas Afrasha Lo, Kasher Nadarta V'Lo, Kasher Ifrashta. Just like Abaye had said, woo! Everyone give yourselves a pat on the back. That was not a walk in the park. Okay, so I have actually written here, Kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami, but the truth is that as I was preparing this outline, I actually didn't realize that there was more to it. While I was going over it in my head and going through the different sections, no, the first part is really kol ha-omed liftos kipadu dami. So we had said that when it comes to kol ha-omed liftos kipadu dami, Reb Shimon would say that when it comes to paraduma, for example, since there's a mitzvah to be podeh the paraduma, if there's a better one, so we'll consider it like it was already podeh to the extent that it would be considered like there was a shasa kosher and be matami tumas ochlin. However, when it came to a korban mincha, however, where there's no mitzvah to be podeh it, we won't consider it like it was podeh, which is why if you were makdish the grain when it was still connected to the ground, so then it will be considered like there was never a shas kosher, and it will not be matami tumas ochlin. Now, when it comes to ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami, so the Gemara had said it applies just like it does for redeeming a paraduma. That since there's a mitzvah to be part of the paraduma, we also say that by zrikas dam, there's a mitzvah to do zrikas dam, and it will be considered like the zrikas dam has already been done already. That applies to lina, that applies to pigul, and therefore it will be considered mitami tumas ochlin. Only in a scenario where, for example, by lina, if you want to slaughter the korban at the end of the day, there was no time to do zrikas adam. In that case, it would be considered like there's no shasa kosher. Now, Rav Ashi disagrees, and he says it does not apply to zrika, since zrika requires an action, right? So by being poda, we could say, okay, kol ha-omed liftos kipadi dami, but because it doesn't require an action, you just say, okay, fine, I'm transferring the kedusha of this paraduma to his money. But by zrika, you actually have to do something, and therefore we won't say kol ha-omed lizrok kizaruk dami. Now, however, we will say that by me'ila. It does apply to me'ila because that's based on defining kedusha. And once there's already potential to do zrikas adam, the kedusha is gone and there's no longer a din me'ila. It does not apply to tumas ochlin, however, because that is based on defining ochel, and they will only be considered ochel once there was actually the zrikas ha-dam. Sheesh. Then we moved on. There was other. We took it from different angles, but then we moved on to the next Mishnah, where we discussed the declaration of intent for a type of mincha. You must offer the type of mincha that you committed to, right? So if you say, I'm going to bring a minchas machvas, you have to bring a minchas machvas. If you end up bringing a minchas marcheshes, that's fine, but you still have to bring a minchas machvas. But we said that if you said, I'm going to bring this as a minchas machvas, you have to bring this as a minchas machvas. The same thing if he says, I'm going to bring these two isarons in two vessels versus one vessel, it's the same theory. Reb Shimon, however, disagrees, and he says, no, the kli is not me'akid. Even if you said, I'm going to bring a minchas machvas, even if you said, I'm going to bring this in a minchas machvas, we brought in a marcheshes, it's still fine according to Reb Shimon. I think he would say the same thing by two vessels versus one. And we then said at the end of the daf that declaration is only important at the time of the neder. Kasher nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha. That if you, at the time of the neder, you say, I am going to bring a minchas machvas, well, you've committed to a machvas. If you just said, I'm going to bring a mincha, You can bring a machvas, marcheshes, even at the time that you separate the isar and you say, I'm going to bring this as a machvas. Doesn't matter. What matters at the time of the neder, not at the time of the afrasha. Friends, that was Daf 102, Daf Kuf Beis of Masechta Menachos. That was a real kachim daf. That was a throwback to like Zvachim and early days of Menachos. Real tough daf. Friends, just a real slow-moving kachim daf. Woo! Mazel tov to everybody who made it through. I'll catch you tomorrow. Peace out.